Hello, and today we're going to talk about composite chart moon conjunct Pluto. And this is one of the spiciest and most intense aspects we can have in a composite chart. This is one where we really want to look at the temperaments of both individuals in the natal chart first, and we also really want to pay attention to the transits that we're going through when we meet each other, because that's going to give you a lot more information about how this is really going to play out. Composite moon conjunct Pluto is kind of one of the strongest attachment aspects you can have in a relationship chart. It's the kind of relationship where the emotional bond, it doesn't stay on the surface. It really has to go underground immediately. So, people with this aspect in their composite, they're usually going to feel something right away with one another. You just feel this deep magnetic pull a lot of times. And, we can feel very activated in our nervous system by one another. You start noticing how much power or magnitude that this person has to really affect your emotional state. One text can change your entire mood. That's kind of the nature of this aspect. That's how intense it can feel. At the same time, one cold interaction can completely ruin your day. One moment the closeness can feel really euphoric. It's deep attachment, deep merging, deep fear the next. So this is one of those aspects that really asks us to dig deep into our own psyche, our own attachment issues. And so that's why before we even start delineating the aspect, you really want to look at the natal chart, because not everyone will handle Pluto energy the same way. So somebody who might have a moon conjunct Pluto natally, they already know this emotional terrain. So they may already really understand the idea of, being someone who really ruminates or obsesses. They might, crave very intense connections with people, or they might be very activated, by their abandonment fears. So, it's really going to bring out those power struggles, that level of hypervigilance if we already have that going on. So it's really going to kind of act like a trigger. But if we have a more balanced chart, we have a lot of Saturn in the chart, this is going to be, a much easier bond. Someone without, that much Pluto natally, they might experience the relationship just emotionally getting struck by lightning, it's gonna maybe bring out some of the more plutonic traits, suddenly they're more possessive than usual, or more emotionally reactive, consumed by the relationship. It can make them feel a little bit like, oh, I didn't think I wanted to even be in a relationship, but now I feel like I need this person. And so that's why the house overlays, they also matter. If this moon conjunction to Pluto, it lands in the fourth house, family trauma or ancestry, emotional safety wounds, childhood wounds, they can get really activated immediately. If it's in the seventh house, then, the relationship itself becomes, really consuming and transformational. So if it's in the eighth house, this becomes, very intense, very fast. We are triggered into all of our psychological wounds, fear, attachment, sexuality. So the thing about moon conjunct Pluto is really, the relationship itself becomes this container for emotional purging. You can't stay asleep in this relationship. It's just not going to happen. So the bond, it really constantly exposes things underneath the surface, things like repressed anger or fear of abandonment, attachment wounds, our childhood conditioning. We're going to have to really look at these things, where we get jealous or where we carry shame or grief, control issues, fear of betrayal, So if we have a fear of vulnerability, if we, fear needing somebody too much, then the relationship really becomes this kind of pressure cooker for emotional truth. And so this aspect can feel really addictive. Attachment can feel really chemical. The emotional intensity creates a kind of compulsion. So you might find yourself ruminating a lot about this person. You may find yourself monitoring their moods or, analyzing their tone shifts. You can become really deeply aware of any sort of emotional distance. Even if things are good, there can be this like underlying fear of loss. What if they leave? What if they stop loving me? What if I lose access to this connection? So that fear can really create controlling behavior. And, that's where we can start bringing out the manipulative behavior or the emotional testing or, the silent power struggles. Emotional withholding can be a big one with Pluto. So a huge theme with this aspect is emotional survival. Both people are really trying to feel emotionally safe, but because it's Pluto, safety often gets pursued through control instead of trust. Somebody starts monitoring the relationship temperature constantly, for example. Someone becomes hyper aware of rejection, or somebody starts trying to predict abandonment before it happens. So the relationship can become really emotionally claustrophobic if nobody is really conscious of what's happening. So we have to be really careful with this one. It can be a good one, but it can also be very intense. We can do a lot of purging. That's a lot of what this relationship is. It can be this container, like we need to vent. We feel the need, like we love the venting at the end of the day. We can crave it. We feel like very free to do that within this relationship. But so we got to also be careful we're not using each other as a therapist. But honestly, one of the biggest misconceptions about Moon Pluto is that it always looks dramatic externally. And sometimes it's just kind of more quiet, Sometimes the couple, barely raises their voices, but underneath everything feels like life or death emotionally. A 5-minute conversation can carry the deep emotional weight of like a therapy session. And at the same time, things like a really tiny interaction, it can really trigger childhood memories of, the things that you didn't even think that were going to come up, like things that you didn't even think affected you all that much. They all of a sudden, they're kind of being purged out of us. So there's not a lot of room to really hide with this one, And so there's this deep level of honesty that needs to happen, because, we can kind of smell the dishonesty on each other. You can't fake intimacy here. Pluto has a way of exposing things. You can't pretend something is fine when it's not fine, right? So the relationship, it really has this way of like dragging the hidden emotions, the hidden feelings into the light. And sometimes this is through conflict. Sometimes this is through like emotional breakdowns. Sometimes this is like, through sex or crisis. But Pluto always wants truth, right? So it provokes people, in this kind of constant way. We're like poking at each other. And usually what's happening underneath that provocation is like a lot of fear. One person gets distant and the other becomes, very suspicious. One person needs reassurance and the other person feels really like overwhelmed. So the relationship can become this like mirror, kind of reflecting both people's attachment systems back at them. And that's why these relationships often become really transformative. They like force people to really confront the emotional patterns they may have spent like their entire lives avoiding. So You can see this aspect in family relationships too, you know, siblings, parents, and children, generational trauma bonds. So families who go through crisis together, you know, or families that survive immense loss together. I had this with my sister. And so, you know, the bond can be very deep, you know. You do a lot of that emotional purging. So this is one where we have to learn emotional boundaries. Otherwise, people start really kind of emotionally consuming each other. And that is kind of the danger of this aspect. The desire for closeness can become so freaking intense that the individual can start disappearing. You know, one person's mood becomes everybody's mood. And, you know, emotional fusion replaces the level of emotional intimacy. And honestly, this aspect can create relationships where people keep returning to each other over and over again because the bond just feels unfinished. So it can have that feeling even if we break up where it's like, this is the person that got away. We can, again, do a lot of that ruminating. Pluto relationships, they often carry the feeling that there is still, you know, a lot more emotional material to uncover, more truth to kind of expose, or more healing to do. So we can crave that purging, you know. Even after separation, the relationship can really kind of continue in our minds, really psychologically, you know. So this is one that will be very transformative for people. You know, you can't really avoid it. When this aspect presents itself, it's there for a reason. And often that reason is emotional transformation through attachment. The relationship will change both people permanently, whether we like it or not. So sometimes that can be really beautiful. Sometimes that can be really painful. And sometimes it can be both. So this is really an intoxicating one. You know, a lot of people spend their lives feeling emotionally unseen. And so then this aspect really comes along and, you know, notices everything. And so this is one that can just kind of feel like everything because it's so naked in a way. And so, you know, this is going to be one where it really sticks to the marrow in our bones. And so that's why emotional regulation is everything here, you know, because without it, the relationship can really become really emotionally exhausting because both people are kind of constantly reacting from old survival wounds instead of like the present reality. So, you know, one small argument can be like, you know, you don't care about me, or you always leave, or you don't really love me, because Pluto doesn't react in proportion to anything. That's not Pluto, right? Pluto reacts from accumulated, you know, kind of emotional history. So, you know, this is an intense one. It can feel very all or nothing. And that's why you really want to look at the temperament of both people to really kind of understand what kind of Pluto stuff it's going to bring up. And it's also kind of wise to really look at where Pluto is in the chart in general, because that's going to show us our Pluto issues. So like if we have Pluto, I don't know, in the fourth house, it's going to bring up those childhood wounds, right? If we have Pluto going on in, the fifth house, this is going to bring up our wounds around, dating betrayals or jealousy, or, you know, anything that comes from our ability to express ourselves appropriately. Yeah, so we really want to take a look and see where that Pluto is going on. And like if it's like having, you know, if we have like a Venus Pluto situation, it's going to bring out those Venus Pluto issues. So these are all things to really consider when looking at this aspect. And again, if we have, you know, a strong Saturnine person or a strong Jupiterian person, Or, you know, even just somebody who has like a lot of Capricorn in their chart, it's going to be a little bit more stabilizing than somebody who has, you know, a lot of Scorpio. So these are things to consider when looking at a composite chart. But I'd love to hear your stories down below of this aspect in a composite chart. So if you have a loved one or a crush with this aspect, let me know down below what your story is, how you experience it, because that's how we learn astrology, by sharing stories and experiences. I will be back soon with a new astrology video, and everyone take care.